She didn't notice the rumble at first. Living 2 blocks from the highway meant you got used to the constant growl of engines, the wheeze of 18-wheelers, the impatient honking of tourists passing through, Millbrook on their way to somewhere better. But this sound was different, deeper, angrier, like thunder that wouldn't quit. Sarah was refilling the coffee for table 6 when the first Harley pulled into the parking lot, followed by another, then another, until the small-town diner was surrounded by a dozen motorcycles that looked like they'd ridden straight out of a nightmare. "Oh, sweet Jesus," muttered Dolores, the 60-year-old cook who'd worked at Rosie's diner since before Sarah was born. "We're about to get robbed. I just know it." But Sarah wasn't afraid of the bikers. When you've spent 3 years with a man who used you as a punching bag, whenever the Bills lost a game or his boss looked at him wrong or the sky was simply blue that day, a bunch of leather-clad strangers didn't seem all that terrifying. Fear, she'd learned, came in familiar packages. Wore the cologne you bought for Christmas. Knew exactly where to hit so the bruises wouldn't show at work. The bikers filed in, their boots heavy on the checkered linoleum, their presence filling the small diner like smoke. They were rough-looking men, covered in tattoos that snaked up their arms and necks, with beards that would make a lumberjack jealous and enough metal piercing. Their faces to set off airport, detectors from a mile away. The other customers, a retired couple sharing a slice of apple pie, a traveling salesman nursing his 3rd cup of coffee, 2 teenagers who'd been making eyes at each other over milkshakes, all fell silent, watching, waiting. The man who walked in last was clearly the leader. He stood about 6'3", with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and arms thick as tree trunks. A scar ran down the left side of his face, from temple to jaw, giving him the look of someone who'd seen the worst life had to offer and hadn't blinked. The back of his leather vest read Road Reapers MC in blood-red letters, with President embroidered underneath. His name, according to the patch over his heart, was Reaper. Sarah grabbed her notepad and approached, their table with the same tired smile she'd perfected over the past 3 years. "Welcome to Rosie's. Can I get you gentlemen started with some coffee?" Reaper looked up at her, and for a moment, his hard expression softened almost imperceptibly. His eyes, startlingly blue against his weathered face, locked onto hers, then traveled down to where she was gripping her notepad. Her left sleeve had ridden up just slightly, revealing the edge of a bruise that bloomed across her wrist like a storm cloud. "Coffee would be great, miss," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "And maybe some menus when you get a chance." Sarah nodded, pulling her sleeve down quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. But as she turned to walk away, she felt his eyes following her, not in the predatory way she'd grown accustomed to from her boyfriend, Marcus, but with something that looked almost like concern. Over the next hour, Sarah served the bikers their food, 17 orders of eggs, bacon, toast, and hash browns, enough coffee to float a battleship, and 6 slices of Dolores's famous cherry pie. They were polite, surprisingly so, saying please and thank you, leaving no mess, speaking in low voices that didn't disturb the other diners. But the whole time, she could feel Reaper watching her. It was when she was clearing their plates that everything changed. Sarah reached across the table to grab a coffee cup, and her sleeve rode up again. This time, there was no hiding the bruises, dark purple marks that wrapped around her forearm, like a handcuff, clearly in the shape of fingers. Someone had grabbed her hard and recently. "How'd you get those?" Reaper's voice cut through the clatter of dishes. Sarah froze, her rehearsed lie dying on her lips. "I'm clumsy. Walked into a... Don't." His voice was firm but not unkind. "I've got 3 sisters. I know what clumsy looks like, and that ain't it." The diner had gone quiet again. Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes, felt the familiar shame washing over her like dirty water. "It's nothing. I'm handling it." "You're handling it?" One of the other bikers, a man with Crusher on his vest, let out a bitter laugh. "Sweetheart, bruises like that say you ain't handling nothing." "Please," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously at the door. Marcus sometimes came by the diner on his lunch break, usually to make sure she wasn't talking to any male customers, wasn't smiling too much, wasn't doing any of the 1,000 things that set him off. "Just leave it alone." Reaper stood up slowly, his massive frame unfolding until he towered over her. But instead of feeling threatened, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Protected. "What's his name?" "I can't." "What's his name?" Reaper repeated, his voice carrying a weight that made it clear this wasn't a request. "Marcus Holloway," Sarah said finally, the words tumbling out like she'd been waiting years to say them. "But you can't do anything. You don't understand. If he thinks I told someone, if he finds out I talked, he'll—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Reaper pulled out his wallet and placed $300 bills on the table, nearly triple what their meal had cost. "For the food," he said. Then he placed 5 more $100 bills on top. "And that's for you. For whatever you need, a bus ticket, first month's rent somewhere, a good lawyer. Your choice." "I can't take that," Sarah protested, even as her eyes widened at more money than she'd seen in months. "You can and you will." Reaper's voice was gentle but final. "And don't you worry about Marcus Holloway. He won't be bothering you anymore." Before Sarah could respond, before she could ask what he meant, the bikers were filing out of the diner, their boots thundering across the floor, their engines roaring to life like a pack of mechanical beasts. Sarah watched through the window as they rode away, the money still sitting on the table like a promise. She had no idea what they were planning. She had no idea that Reaper, whose real name was James Sullivan, former Marine, father of 2 daughters, and founder of a biker club that had started as a support group for veterans, was about to turn Millbrook upside down. What happened next became the stuff of legend in their small town. The bikers didn't hurt Marcus. They didn't have to. What they did was far more effective. They showed up at his workplace, Morrison's auto shop, where Marcus had been bragging for 3 years about how he kept his woman in line. Reaper walked straight into the manager's office and laid out photographs. Not of Marcus hitting Sarah, they didn't have those, but of Sarah's bruises, taken with her permission in the diner's bathroom before they left, time-stamped and dated. Of the police reports, Sarah had been too scared to file herself, but that Reaper's connections had helped her complete that afternoon. Of text messages Marcus had sent, threatening, cruel, showing a pattern of abuse that made the manager's face go white. "This man works for you," Reaper said simply. "And I thought you'd want to know what kind of person represents your business in this community." Marcus was fired within the hour, but the bikers didn't stop there. They visited Marcus's apartment building and had a quiet word with his landlord, explaining the situation, showing the same documentation. They made sure every business owner in Millbrook knew exactly who Marcus Holloway was and what he'd done. They didn't threaten anyone. They didn't break any laws. They simply ensured that the invisible violence that had been happening behind closed doors became very, very visible. The social ostracism was immediate and absolute. In a small town like Millbrook, reputation was everything, and Marcus Holloway's had just been destroyed. He couldn't get served at restaurants. He couldn't find a new job. His friends, who'd laughed along when he made jokes about keeping Sarah in check, suddenly didn't return his calls. He'd become a pariah overnight. More importantly, he'd become afraid, because 12 bikers made it very clear that if Marcus ever came near Sarah again, if he so much as sent her a text message, there would be consequences. Not violent ones necessarily, but consequences that would make his current situation look like a vacation. Within a week, Marcus had left town, slinking away to try to rebuild his life somewhere else, somewhere people didn't know his story. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself surrounded by support she'd never expected. Dolores gave her extra shifts and a raise. The local women's shelter, contacted by Reaper's wife Teresa, offered Sarah free counseling. The bikers, these rough, terrifying-looking men, set up a fund to help her get her own apartment, start over, rebuild the life that Marcus had tried to destroy. "Why?" Sarah asked Reaper when he stopped by the diner 2 weeks later, this time alone, this time just for a peaceful cup of coffee and a slice of pie. "Why would you do all this for a stranger?" Reaper was quiet for a moment, stirring sugar into his coffee. "My youngest sister, Katie, she married a guy who seemed real nice. Charming, you know. Good job, said all the right things. 6 months later, she was in the hospital with 3 broken ribs and a fractured jaw. Told everyone she'd fallen down the stairs." He looked up, his blue eyes intense. She didn't leave him until it was almost too late. "And you know what haunts me? All the people who saw the signs and said nothing. All the folks who thought it wasn't their business. I'm not your sister, Sarah said softly. No, but you're somebody's daughter, somebody's friend. You matter, Sarah. And maybe I can't go back and save Katie from those first few years, but I can make damn sure that when I see someone who needs help, I don't look the other way. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in the parking lot of Rosie's diner, holding the keys to her new apartment, about to start classes at the community college. She'd put on weight, the good kind, the kind that comes from not living in constant stress. She'd laughed more in the past few months than in the previous 3 years combined. She'd even started dating again, a kind man from her psychology class who held doors and asked about her day and thought her opinions mattered. The Road Reapers still stopped by the diner once a month, their monthly ride always ending at Rosie's for coffee and pie. They'd become fixtures in Millbrook, their fearsome reputation replaced by something warmer. People knew them now as the bikers who'd stood up for Sarah, who'd proven that sometimes the most unlikely heroes wore leather and rode motorcycles. And Sarah? She'd learned that strength comes in unexpected packages. That family isn't always about blood, and that sometimes salvation arrives on 2 wheels with a thundering engine and a heart bigger than anyone expects. The bruises had faded, but the kindness? That would last forever.